wanted to know how it had got here from Jerusalem, nearly 3,000 miles away by sea. This is a long way from Palestine. Can you tell me the story of how James's body came to be here?
From Palestine, there were boats arriving here originally bringing stone containing tin ore. It was this stone that was originally traded here from Palestine. That's why it's said that St. James arrived here in a stone boat.
The cult of St. James appeared at a critical time for Europe. It was under attack from another emerging faith, Islam. Arab armies had already conquered large parts of Spain. A hero was needed to rally the Christian faithful. Who better than one of Jesus' disciples?
St. James was considered as the, if you like, the symbolic patron of the Christian struggle against the Muslims of southern Spain. In the later Middle Ages, St. James is portrayed in art and in sculpture as Santiago Matamoros, the Moor Slayer. He's normally portrayed on horseback, sword in hand, slain enemies underneath the hooves of his horse.
To promote the cult of St. James in Spain, it seems the church was prepared to believe in a totally new legend about his life. Under the altar of the church in Padron is a large stone pillar, to which, according to the tradition, the boat carrying St. James's body was moored when it arrived by river 2,000 years ago.
As you can see by that inscription, it says in Latin, "Pia credito," which means by pious belief. But by pious belief, it does not necessarily mean that it's a fiction or that it's a fantasy.
It has to be said that there's no definitive evidence that James had either travelled to Spain to preach or was buried in Spain until many, many centuries later. It's in the 7th century that we have the first reports or claims that James had travelled to Spain during his own lifetime to preach. There's also a hymn of praise from the Kingdom of Asturias in the north of Spain from the 780s, which makes the same claim. But none of these sources say that James was buried there.
According to the tradition, James's body lay hidden in a secret cave for 700 years. Then a local hermit saw a star in the sky which guided him to the burial site. He told the local bishop, and several years later, the first shrine was built on the site, and the town of Santiago grew up around it. Today, a massive cathedral dominates the area. The dean agreed to show me the cathedral's historical archive.
We know that the tomb of St. James was discovered in approximately 830. Here we can see the illustration of the Archbishop Theodomir of Iria Flavia finding the tomb of the Apostle James. And here is the illustration of Alfonso II, and beside it we find details of the privilege he granted this shrine.
Given that there were so many competing saints' cults, it was very important that a shrine had influential backers, that it had patronage, that it had publicists. And in the case of St. James, we know that members of the Asturian royal family were enthusiastic supporters.
At the end of the 19th century, the cathedral authorities began a massive archaeological investigation beneath the cathedral. It was a time when Christianity was under attack from new developments in science and history. The religious authorities were desperate to find scientific evidence to reinforce the legend of St. James and keep the faithful happy. They first uncovered a vast Roman necropolis, an ancient cemetery, with tombs dating back to the 1st century. Then, right below the cathedral's main altar, the church's archaeologists found another ancient tomb.
There they found the urn that contains the box that holds the remains of the apostle and his two disciples, St. Athanasius and St. Theodore. This was in 1879. Then there was a long process of authentication that lasted 5 years, and it was definitively decreed to be authentic by the Vatican on the 24th of July, 1884.
Can you be sure about what you found? Can you be absolutely certain that here we have the bones of the apostle?
Now, in this case, there is a very high level of certainty. We could say that all reasonable doubt, whether these relics are authentic or not, has been overcome. In other words, certainty outweighs all reasonable doubt.
Jose Suarez Otero is an independent local archaeologist.
From an archaeological point of view, we cannot guarantee that it is actually the Apostle St. James who is buried there. The problem is that those remains may or may not be the remains of the Apostle St. James, and it will always be difficult to prove it either way.
Is it important that the bones and the tomb are those of St. James?
Everything that has been built here and the flow of pilgrims have both been because of this fact. Of course, it is in our best interests that it is never proven to be a calculated untruth, like some people nowadays claim it to be.
If a shrine could flourish, large numbers of pilgrims would begin to visit that shrine. One important side product of pilgrims was they brought money to the shrine, and the bishopric of Santiago de Compostela becomes much richer.
It seems to me that in its bid to create a new Christian hero to champion Europe's battle with Islam, the Church lost sight of the real meaning of being a disciple. How they were prepared to commit their lives not to fight other believers, but to combat injustice and oppression all over the world. Exploiting the power of the 12 disciples did not just depend on owning a piece of them. It could be harnessed in other ways too. The first Christians realized that a sure way to get your sacred writings noticed was to claim that one of the disciples had written them. When it was being decided which text should be included in the New Testament, having such a big-name author was a huge bonus, even if he didn't actually write it. According to tradition, the disciple who wrote the most was John. He is supposed to have authored a gospel, 3 letters, and one of Christianity's most extraordinary texts, the Book of Revelation.
The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants.
Is there agreement amongst the scholars, amongst church traditions, that John wrote all of those pieces of writing in the New Testament?
Well, the first portrait of this that we have is by a church father by the name of Irenaeus in the 2nd century. And he tells us that there is a John who was the beloved disciple, who wrote the gospel, and he also received the revelation on the island of Patmos. Now, even as early as the 3rd century, there was a Christian by the name of Dionysius who disagreed with this. He saw that there was potentially 2 Johns. And today, biblical scholars, they think there was perhaps even 3 Johns that composed these documents that we have in the New Testament.
Many biblical scholars now believe that the books in the Bible traditionally attributed to John were actually written by 3 men: John the Evangelist, John the Presbyter, and John of Patmos, and that the disciple John might not have been any of them.
Apostles' names get linked to Gospels and sacred writings because it's like the authority of cities. You need a big name attached to a Gospel or to a letter. So this is one of the key processes for the New Testament canonization, linking a letter or a gospel or whatever with a big name.
For some of the early Christians, it didn't matter if John had actually written all those books. What mattered was his name and the power and status it gave them as a brand. And the fact that when it was being decided which sacred text would be included in the New Testament, theirs would be top of the list. One of the books attributed to John is the New Testament's strangest text, full of violent and disturbing language, and one that has been used by some of the more extreme Christian fundamentalists to prophesy the end of the world.
And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a great voice, If any man worshippeth the beast and his image, and receiveth a mark on his forehead, or upon his hand, he also shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God.
The Greek island of Patmos lies in the middle of the Aegean. Today, it is home to a Greek Orthodox monastery, but 2,000 years ago, it was a Roman penal colony. According to tradition, because of his preaching, the disciple John was exiled here by the Romans. It was here, in a cave, that he was supposed to have had a miraculous vision that became the Book of Revelation.
Το μέλλον της ανθρωπότητος. Βέβαια, εμείς δεν θέλουμε...
The fathers of the Eastern Church were always wary about the interpretation of this book, and the Church took care, one could say, to keep this book hidden away, not to use it too much. Of course, in the West, there have been lots of interpretations, some of which are extreme.
Like many people, I find the book is full of disturbing images and written in a code that's hard to understand.
Here is wisdom. He that hath understanding, let him count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. 666.
Now, in the ancient world with languages like Greek and Hebrew, letters represented numbers as well.